March 1944, Rechlin Airfield, Mecklenburg, Germany. The systematic examination of captured enemy aircraft had become a critical function of the Luftwaffe's technical intelligence service. At Airprobungsstelle Rechlin, the Reich's primary aircraft testing and evaluation center, teams of engineers and pilots worked to understand every advantage the Allies possessed in the air war. What they discovered in the early spring of 1944 would fundamentally alter their understanding of American industrial capacity and the future of the air war over Germany. The captured P-51 Mustang arrived at Rechlin on March 6, 1944, transported by rail from a crash site near Brandenburg. It was dented, scorched in places, its propeller twisted like a broken hand. But even in ruin, it radiated menace. German engineers had inspected Spitfires, Thunderbolts, and Lightnings before, but this was different. Rumors had reached them for weeks. American fighters being seen farther east than physics should allow. Reports described escorts staying with bomber formations all the way to Berlin and then back again. Impossible, said the mathematicians. Fuel load alone disproved it, yet here it was, the machine responsible for those impossible sightings. German test officers circled it like surgeons before an autopsy. They expected a trick hidden in its engine or fuselage, a new supercharger, a breakthrough in aerodynamics, some secret fuel additive, something exotic, something brilliant, something German. But before they even opened the cowling, their eyes were drawn to something odd bolted beneath the wings. Two streamlined teardrop-shaped tanks, battered but intact. Not armored, not reinforced. They looked cheap, disposable, a junior engineer muttered. Warum wirft man sie weg? Why would anyone throw fuel tanks away? The question lingered uneasily, because in that moment, they didn't yet realize that these flimsy canisters were not an accessory. They were the reason Germany no longer owned its own sky. When the Mustang arrived, the Luftwaffe's technical officers initially regarded it as simply another Allied single-seat escort fighter, another P-47 or early Spitfire equivalent. Dangerous. Yes, but bound by the same physics and fuel limits. What puzzled them, however, was where this particular P-51 had been captured, and when. The aircraft had come down far deeper inside German territory than any single engine fighter had logically been able to travel, at least according to every range estimate Germany had previously calculated. Until this point, the Luftwaffe had believed that no Allied fighter could accompany heavy bombers much beyond the Ruhr, and certainly not on long-range penetration missions towards central Germany or eastern industrial zones. Their intelligence models assumed that after the bombers crossed a certain latitude, they would again become vulnerable to interception, free from fighter escort and exposed to experienced Jagdgeschwader pilots. But this Mustang's recovery site told a different story. It had not merely escorted a bomber group into Germany, it had stayed long enough to fight, pursue, and engage Luftwaffe interceptors on the return leg. That alone ignited alarm inside the Reich's aviation intelligence hierarchy. The first reports from the air intelligence officers did not focus on the aircraft's speed or armament. They focused on range. The question that startled analysts was simple. How had a single engine fighter traveled this far, still had fuel to fight, and only then been forced down? The Luftwaffe's range tables said this was impossible. At first, several German engineers assumed that the Americans must be quietly operating a secret twin engine fighter disguised as a single-engine airframe, an idea that revealed just how disorienting the Mustang's presence deep inside German airspace was. Others theorized some breakthrough in engine tuning or aerodynamic drag reduction. The DB engineers from Daimler-Benz were especially curious whether Packard's licensed Merlin had been modified beyond the known British specifications. The more the officers looked at the simple flight map, Berlin proximity on one side, Belgium and England on the other, the more unsettling the implications became. If bombers could now be escorted to the German heartland, the sanctuary philosophy that protected German fighter bases, fuel depots, and synthetic plants was effectively obsolete. The shock inside the Luftwaffe was not merely tactical, it was strategic. The technical division urgently launched a deeper inquiry into the Mustang's internal fuel tanks. They found the standard fuselage tank, the wing tanks, nothing wildly unfamiliar. The Merlin engine was powerful but still comprehensible. The propeller and supercharger were advanced, but not unthinkable. So if not inside the airframe, where was the secret? The answer wasn't in what the German engineers could see, but rather what was missing. The underwing hardpoints were empty. An intelligence captain made the first written note that hinted at the real breakthrough. If this aircraft launched from England with auxiliary fuel tanks that were then discarded after depletion, its combat radius could far exceed our previous assessments. That sentence triggered a cascade of deeper examination. The Luftwaffe already knew of external fuel tanks, but every existing assumption relied on metal tanks. Heavy, limited in capacity, and always reusable. What they discovered next would overturn those assumptions. A quiet but revolutionary piece of American wartime engineering. At this stage, they still didn't know what these tanks were made of, how light they were, or how cheaply they were being produced. But they now understood that something new, something industrially simple yet strategically devastating, must have been hanging under the Mustang's wings when it took off. The Mustang by itself was impressive, but the Mustang with its mysterious drop tanks was redefining the war. The next step was to understand how. The breakthrough came not from an engineer, but from a logistics officer. During the post-crash inventory, a requisition note from the recovery unit mentioned the presence of tank fragments located near the wing station debris field. These fragments had been assumed to be scrap aluminum sheeting, torn wreckage from the wing. But when an Oberleutnant from the technical detachment examined them more closely under proper lighting, he stopped cold. The shards were not metal at all. They flexed slightly under pressure. They were not granular like bakelite. They were layered, coarse on the interior, lacquered on the exterior. He called for 2 additional samples to be cleaned and re-examined. By afternoon, engineers from the Luftwaffe's materials division were stunned by what they were holding. The auxiliary tanks had been made of treated paper. Not thin paper, but a compressed resin-hardened laminate designed to be just strong enough to withstand fuel load and aerodynamic forces, yet cheap enough to throw away. The idea was as elegant as it was horrifying to Germany's war planners. These were not conventional reusable drop tanks. They were single-use, expendable fuel reservoirs that cost a fraction of a metal assembly. A short memorandum was written immediately for senior staff at the Reich Air Ministry. The Americans are manufacturing large aerodynamic fuel tanks from cellulose fiber composites, impregnated with lacquer, for one-time operational range extension. These may be produced in quantity without use of strategic alloys. That last sentence was the one that rattled the upper echelon. The strategic earthquake aluminum was, by 1944, a controlled and increasingly scarce strategic metal in Germany. Every kilogram had to be budgeted. Fighters, bombers, transport wings, spare parts. The Reich could not build external tanks without sacrificing combat aircraft production. America, by contrast, had just sidestepped the metals problem entirely. They weren't rationing drop tanks. They were printing them from pulp, not ore. To the material scientists examining the fragments, the implications were obvious. A fighter could now carry more than double its usual fuel load without burdensome production costs or the need for retrieval. Tanks could be discarded in flight. No recovery logistics. No maintenance backlog, no metal wasted, no shortage bottleneck. It was industrial warfare expressed through disposability. But another detail captured even more alarm. The tanks were surprisingly fuel-tight. The lacquer used had created a surface nearly as impermeable as aluminum. The seams were bonded, not riveted, further reducing weight and improving aerodynamics. The Luftwaffe had never imagined paper could be engineered into a battlefield asset. An engineering revolution. Hiding in plain sight only. When the drop tank's mounting ring was reconstructed, did engineers understand the full genius of the system? The tank did not require complex fastening. It mated to a universal pylon that any P-51 could accept with minimal modification. The same aircraft could alternate between combat loadouts and ferry profiles simply by replacing the external tanks. This flexibility was a luxury Germany no longer had. Their fighters were interceptors, short-range, high-climb defensive weapons. The P-51 had effectively transformed into a strategic escort platform, not a tactical fighter, and it had done so through an innovation small enough to be mistaken for battlefield trash. The psychological blow. Perhaps the greatest shock was not technical at all, but psychological. It proved beyond doubt that the Americans were not only outbuilding the Luftwaffe, they were outthinking it in industrial engineering. The German engineers suddenly realized this was not a one-off experiment. If such tanks were arriving regularly on Mustangs across Germany, then tens of thousands of them were being mass-produced in American factories, silently, cheaply, and continuously. The Mustang's range had never been the mystery. The real weapon was American production philosophy, and for the first time, the Reich's technical intelligence services were forced to confront an unpleasant truth. Germany was fighting a war of machines, but America was fighting a war of manufacturing systems. By early April 1944, A full reconstruction study was underway in a sealed hangar at Rechlin. The paper tanks were no longer curiosities. They were now evidence of a strategic shift. Engineers from the Luftwaffe's Materials Bureau, fuel specialists from Daimler, Benz, and aerodynamicists from Messerschmitt were brought in to evaluate the captured components. The first test was crude but telling. A partial tank segment was refilled with aviation fuel and left on supports for 48 hours. There was no measurable seepage. When a technician tapped the hardened shell with a spanner, the resulting tone was not soft but ceramic, proof of how thoroughly the lacquered cellulose had polymerized. Nobody had expected this kind of performance from paper. The second test involved aerodynamic stress simulation. Panels reconstructed to approximately 60% of full scale were placed in a low-pressure wind tunnel. The airflow results were startling. At simulated 350 mph cruise speeds, flexion remained minimal. A metal tank might dent and deform. A paper tank simply bowed slightly and recovered. The tank didn't resist stress, it absorbed it. This was engineering judo. The range calculations. Now came the real question. How far could a Mustang fly with these tanks attached? At a drafting table cluttered with slide rules, lift drag tables, and fuel burn curves, the Luftwaffe's range specialists recalculated the numbers based on total loadout, X108. Gallon paper tanks, external 92 gallons internal capacity. This brought the total to more than 300 gallons of usable fuel. Even using German conservative burn rate estimates, assuming climb inefficiency, headwinds, and suboptimal cruising ratios, the figures staggered the analysts. Maximum ferry range, over 600 miles. Combat radius, 700 plus miles. That meant a P-51 could escort B-17s not only to Berlin, but beyond it, to central Germany, and then return to base. The room fell quiet. This was not an extension of range. This was strategic reach, the kind Germany believed only bombers could possess. Worse still, intelligence dispatches began corroborating field reports from Jagdgeschwader commanders who had already begun noticing something chilling. The American fighters were still engaging in dogfights deep in Reich airspace, sometimes after jettisoning their tanks, meaning they still had fuel reserves left for combat maneuvering after escort duties. Germany had assumed the Mustangs were returning home near empty. They were not. They were arriving over target areas fresh, not exhausted. Disposable warfare. The moment that turned curiosity into dread came when one of the aerodynamicists phrased the issue bluntly. If America can throw fuel tanks away like trash, they are not constrained by scarcity. They are constrained only by time. That was the turning point of the meeting. It was here the Luftwaffe intelligence officers realized they were no longer dealing with an air war measured in aircraft or pilots, but in supply chain math. Germany was rationing parts. America was shipping expendability. One insight crystallized into a sentence that later appeared in a confidential technical memorandum. The United States has solved range with industry, not engineering. A weapon Germany could not mirror. Could Germany copy it? In theory, yes. In practice, absolutely not. There was no surplus resin production, no pulp allocation that wouldn't cripple other manufacturing, no transport capacity to haul disposable tanks to forward bases. Most critically, there was no industrial slack left in the Reich. Germany could build metal fighters, but only a small number. America could build paper fuel tanks in the thousands without tapping into any of its critical resources. The Luftwaffe realized, perhaps for the first time with absolute clarity, that they were no longer fighting the enemy air force. They were fighting the enemy economy. It was not a difference of technology. It was a difference of scale. The first simulated escort flight test was conducted using a Bf-109 retrofitted with ballast to match the Mustang's drop, tank drag, and fuel weight. It was primitive, but it provided one critical measurement: the time a fighter could loiter near a target before being forced to disengage and return home. For German fighters, that window was usually 7 to 12 minutes, barely enough to intercept, attack, and climb back out of the bomber's defensive box. The Mustang's simulations, based on US fuel loads and engine efficiency, showed a loiter window of up to 45 minutes, nearly 4 times longer. That changed everything. German interceptors didn't merely have less fuel, they had less freedom. Once refitted with real Mustang aerodynamic data and corrected for cruise efficiency, the test flights produced a chilling strategic conclusion. The Americans could choose when to fight. The Luftwaffe could only choose whether to show up and die. The psychological collapse takes shape reports coming from front. Geschwader now made a new kind of terrible sense. Pilots had been complaining for weeks. The Mustangs are still there on our second pass. We disengaged, climbed, tried to reposition. They were waiting. They do not seem to leave. Before Rechlin had this Mustang in their hangar, such statements were dismissed as exaggeration or panic under pressure. Now, they were recognized as simple truth. The Americans didn't need to sprint to Berlin, attack, and leave. They could escort, bait, linger, punish, and pursue. They had fuel for decision-making. Germany had fuel only for survival. Control of the sky becomes control of time. A. Rechlin, range study officer, distilled it into a single sentence during a classified debrief. They have extended not only their reach, but their presence. It wasn't the Mustang's speed that terrified them anymore. It was the duration of threat. A fast interceptor could be outrun. A persistent hunter could not be outweighted. This was the birth of continuous air dominance, though the term would not exist for decades. Over Germany in 1944, it was simply felt as dread. A mock combat demonstration to illustrate this new tactical geography. A field demonstration was staged. One pilot played the Mustang escort. Another played a German interception fighter. They acted out a bomber escort approach at range. The Mustang pilot didn't attack immediately. He waited. He waited until the German fighter had to commit, until his fuel clock forced him to either engage prematurely or retreat. That's when the American pilot would move in. There was no chase, there was no duel, there was position plus time plus inevitability. When the mock demonstration ended, a Luftwaffe major overseeing the test reportedly removed his gloves and whispered, "They are not fighting us. They are starving us of time." The strategic horror sets, and this is the moment Rechlin stopped viewing the paper tanks as an engineering curiosity and began understanding them as a weapon of air strategy. Up to this point in the war, German defense planning assumed the predictable rhythm of fighter escorts: arrive, attack once, withdraw due to fuel constraints. But that assumption, like so many others, was now obsolete. The Mustang wasn't simply present in Germany, it was waiting. And when an enemy can wait, he owns the battlefield before a shot is even fired. Rechlin's intelligence bureau convened an emergency consultation with senior Luftwaffe planners in late April 1944. The agenda was simple, but crushing in implication. If the Americans can wait for us, how do we survive? 3 possible counters were proposed. 3 were dismissed as unworkable. Counter-proposal. 1. Outrange them. The first idea was a theoretical extension of the German fighter range using existing airframes. Engineers proposed belly, tanks, and wing-mounted tanks for Bf-109s and FW-190s. On paper, it looked plausible. But German fighters already suffered from catastrophic takeoff performance due to short airfields and underpowered engines at fuel. Heavy weight, even more damning, range would come at the cost of maneuvering fuel. A German fighter extended for range was a slow, heavy, dog-fighting target the moment the escort showed up. They could reach the battlefield, but they would die upon arrival. Rejected. Counter-proposal. 2. Hit the bombers before the escorts. Arrive. This was the old doctrine, the Luftwaffe's favorite fantasy. Long outdated, strike fast, intercept early, and escape before the Americans respond. But now the escorts arrived with the bombers. They didn't follow them. They traveled ahead of them. Rechlin's fuel loiter study proved there was no safe window left. Not at the border, not over central targets, not over return routes. The bomber stream was no longer a corridor. It was a moving fortress under continuous guard. Rejected. Counter-proposal 3. Build bigger, longer range fighters. This was the desperate solution. The idea that Germany could create its own equivalent of the Mustang. It was technically possible, on a blackboard, but not in Hitler's Germany. There were no factories free for prototyping, no fuel left for test flights, no aluminum to spare. The German war machine was no longer an industrial organism. It was a rationing operation with wings. The paper tanks made this painfully clear. The Americans weren't designing around scarcity. They were designing around abundance. Rechlin's engineers reached a grim conclusion. We can copy technology. We cannot copy capacity. The Mustang's other weapon, pursuit. The next shock came from analyzing combat reports. Commanders had assumed Mustangs escorted bombers and disengaged after completing the mission. But Rechlin's analysts began noticing something chilling. Mustangs were pursuing German fighters after the interception, sometimes all the way to landing fields. This meant the paper tanks weren't just allowing escort duty. They allowed tactical follow-through, pursuit into disengagement corridors, fuel, exhaustion zones, and landing approaches. For a fighter pilot, retreat used to mean survival. Now retreat meant being hunted. The psychological break one Rechlin intelligence note circulated to high command summarized the transformation with brutal accuracy. The Americans now own the space in which German pilots make decisions. No fuel means no choice. No choice means no tactics. No tactics means defeat before engagement. This is why Luftwaffe pilot morale began collapsing long before the airframes did. They weren't losing to better pilots, or even better aircraft. They were losing to industrial inevitability. A new kind of doom mid. May 1944. The Luftwaffe understood that the Mustang was not a fighter plane upgraded with tanks. It was a strategic lever that fractured German air doctrine at its core. There was no counter, design, no allocation plan, no operational workaround. The Reich had run out of time, and the Americans had built a weapon that generated time. By late May 1944, Rechlin's engineers had completed their technical analysis, but what they uncovered next was tactical, not mechanical. The Mustang was not merely adding range to bomber escorts. It was weaponizing predictability. For years, the Luftwaffe had relied on a single, unchanging rhythm of battle. Bombers enter Reich. Airspace. German fighters scramble, intercept from high altitude, attack once or twice, disengage. Due to fuel, return to base. The Mustang broke step 5. If the Germans could not leave the battle early, the trap closed on them, slowly, silently, surgically. The moment of realization. A Rechlin tactics officer illustrated the new danger in a staff briefing using a chalkboard map. We used to intercept the bombers. Now we are being intercepted by the escorts. The Germans weren't initiating the engagement anymore. They were walking directly into a waiting ambush. The Mustang pilots didn't react to German attacks. They anticipated them. They planned for them. They arrived early and waited. This was not defense. This was positional warfare in the air. The escort becomes the hunter before the paper tanks. Allied escorts were sprinters. Now they were sentries. They had time to climb, time to reposition, time to stalk. A Luftwaffe flight instructor at Rechlin put it bluntly. We are no longer ambushing them. They are ambushing us. And because the Mustangs could jettison their paper tanks and become fully agile fighters within seconds, they lost nothing by waiting. The tanks were a leash until the moment combat began. Then they were discarded like a snake shedding skin. And the Mustang became a predator again. German pilots felt it first front. Line combat reports revealed eerie changes in air behavior. Mustangs were appearing right where interception routes intersected. They were sitting high above clouds, out of sight, until German fighters committed. They often struck before Germans saw the bomber formation. They targeted escorts. Of the escorts, the leaders, not the stragglers. This is when German pilots started describing an emotion unfamiliar in 1942. Hesitation. Not fear of being shot down. Fear of being cornered. Because with the paper tanks, the Mustang didn't need to win the first engagement. It only needed to force the German fighters to burn fuel and remove their escape route. When escape dies, doctrine dies. The Luftwaffe had always taught, if a fight turns bad, disengage, climb, regroup. But now the rulebook was reversed. Disengagement, for pursuit. Retreat to exposure. Fuel exhaustion, execution. The Mustang stole the German pilot's exit door. This is why attrition suddenly skyrocketed. Not because pilot skill declined, but because options disappeared. A Luftwaffe captain summarized the collapse in a post-engagement log. When I saw the Mustang above me, I did not see an aircraft. I saw a trap that had already closed. A new kind of fear. Rechlin didn't just uncover an American technology. It uncovered the new architecture of the air war. Presence, position, ambush, pursuit, destruction, not a duel. Not a contest. A system. A paper tank made all of it possible. And by the time Germany understood the system, it was already too late to break it. Because even if they killed a Mustang, America could build 10 more and 10,000 more tanks, faster than Germany could rebuild hope. The Reich had finally discovered the truth. They did not lose control of the airspace. They had lost control of time inside it. The more Rechlin dug into the Mustang's drop tanks, the clearer the truth became. This was not an engineering trick. It was a philosophy of war. The Luftwaffe had always treated the fighter as the core of its doctrine. A pilot, a machine, a battle. Limited scope, limited horizon, but America was not building fighters. America was building systems, and the P-51 with disposable paper tanks was just one component of a larger machine. Factories, shipping networks, fuel logistics, deployment, sustainment, replacement, escalation. The Germans suddenly realized they weren't fighting an enemy air force. They were fighting an airborne supply chain with guns. Industrial warfare versus heroic warfare. German doctrine was built on ace culture. The pilot as warrior, skill as dominance, the duel as the proving ground. American doctrine was built on infrastructure. Volume as dominance, logistics as firepower, expendability as strategy. For the Luftwaffe, every fighter was precious. For the US, every fighter was replaceable. For the Luftwaffe, every drop of fuel was rationed. For the US, fuel was shipped by the oceanful. And here lay the final revelation. The paper tank was not a clever solution. It was a symptom of abundance. Why paper is what broke them. The German engineers weren't humiliated by the Mustang's speed. They weren't shaken by its aerodynamics. They were shaken by the fact that something made out of cellulose and resin was strong enough for combat, because America could afford to waste it. Germany built for endurance because nothing could be wasted. America built for tempo, because everything could be replaced. It wasn't a better fighter. It was a better relationship with scarcity. The war Germany couldn't fight for years. Berlin believed the war would be decided the old way, by decisive engagements, by superior engineering, by genius breakthroughs. But Rechlin now saw the real battlefield: supply lines, tonnage, throughput, manufacturing velocity, geographic reach. The Allies weren't outflying the Reich, they were outrunning history itself. By the time Germany adapted, the war had already shifted from tactical advantage to industrial inevitability. German realization: they were out of time. Briefing sent to the Luftwaffe High Command in June 1944 contained a stark concluding sentence. The Americans have engineered a condition in which they can project power faster than we can respond to it. Not can fight harder, not can fly better, can respond faster. Speed is a function of their frame. Responsiveness is a function of the industry, and industry is what Germany no longer has. The final blind spot, Rechlin's analysts now saw the one fatal assumption that doomed the Reich. We believed war was a contest of capability. The Americans believed war was a contest of capacity. Capability has a ceiling. Capacity has a horizon. And in 1944, America's horizon now stretched, literally, to Berlin and back. That is why the Luftwaffe was collapsing long before it was destroyed. It wasn't just losing fuel, it was losing future. By early 1944, the breakthrough had finally come. The long-legged Mustang, its wings heavy with gasoline, filled with lifelines, was now crossing into the heart of the Reich. Berlin, the once untouchable symbol of Nazi power, was no longer a distant, unreachable dream for Allied airmen. It was squarely within escort range, and the psychological impact of that single fact was immense. On both sides of the war, the first appearance over Berlin on March 4, 1944, P-51s escorted B-17 bombers all the way to Berlin for the first time. It was a mission previously considered suicidal. Luftwaffe controllers were initially stunned. American fighters had always turned back before Berlin, but now they kept coming. Their tight formations shadowed the bomber streams right to the capital's doorstep. To the Germans watching below, the message was unmistakable. The Allies had pulled down the last barrier of distance. For the Luftwaffe High Command, it was more than a tactical shock. It meant the Reich's defensive perimeter had been broken in the most absolute way possible. If Berlin could be escorted, then no factory, fuel depot, radar station, or assembly plant was safe anywhere. A strategic earthquake for years, Germany's industrial base had survived behind what was essentially a rain shield. Yes, bombers reached deep targets, but without escorts, losses were catastrophic. The Luftwaffe simply had to wait for the moment when the bombers had passed the final point of fighter protection, and then they would strike like hawks into a flock of cattle. But now, they were forced to fight P-51s before the bombers, during, and even after they disengaged. This upset the entire structure of German air defense before drop tanks, 1943, after drop tanks, 1944. Intercept unescorted bombers must fight fully escorted formations. Local defense strategy must defend deep inside the Reich. Small radius scrambles effective constant long range coverage needed. Attrition favored Germany. Attrition now favored the Allies' fighter pilots hunted bombers. Now they were hunted. The Luftwaffe was being forced into a war of exhaustion. Exactly the sort of war that the Allies could afford, and Germany could not. Morale shock. The view from the ground, to German civilians looking skyward, the Mustang's presence carried a different kind of message. Nowhere is out of reach. Beginning in early 1944, many diary entries from Berlin mention not just bombers, but their hawk, like escorts circling above. The emotional distance that had protected the capital, the idea that the front is somewhere else, vanished. The war was now overhead, and it flew with American stars on its wings. Tactical transformation. The Mustangs take the hunt west. To east previously, raids were purely defensive for American fighters. Their job was to stay near bombers, but with extended range and superior performance, Mustangs began going off-leash. They patrolled ahead and above the bomber streams, ambushing German fighters before they could even form up. The hunter had become the hunted. German squadron after squadron found itself shredded over its own airfields even before takeoff. This was something that simply could not happen without enormous range. A fighter without drop tanks couldn't afford to loiter. A fighter with drop tanks could dictate the fight. Escort now meant air superiority. The turning point from Berlin. The Allies were now one small leap away from striking the last pillars of German resistance: synthetic fuel plants, ball bearing factories, transportation hubs, and aircraft production lines. The Mustang's ability to escort, sweep, hunt, and return in one continuous mission fundamentally reshaped the bombing campaign from one of attrition to one of annihilation. Berlin was not just a city. It was the psychological high ground of the European theater. Once that sky was breached, the end of the Luftwaffe became a matter of time, not chance. And all of this, the escort to Berlin, the collapse of Germany's air strategy, the shattering of its defensive illusion, rested on a single technological enabler: range, delivered by a metal tank full of fuel, hanging under a fighter's wings. When Allied P-51s first began escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back, German intelligence officers were baffled. Their mathematical models said this was impossible. The Mustangs shouldn't have the fuel capacity to reach Berlin, escort the bombers through combat, and still return to England. Something didn't add up. It wasn't until damaged and crash-landed Mustangs were recovered behind German lines that scientists finally got their answer. Teams from the Luftwaffe's technical inspection units removed the strange metal cylinders mounted beneath the Mustang's wings. At first glance, they looked crude, thin, cheaply made steel or paper, but that simplicity was the secret. Germany had been over-engineering everything. Perfectly machined, reusable tanks built for long-term use. The Americans went the opposite way. Cheap, disposable range. These drop tanks were designed to be used once, emptied, then discarded in combat. They were light, mass-produced, and simple enough to manufacture by the tens of thousands. That meant every fighter could launch with immediate long-range capability, without altering its aerodynamic performance once the tanks were jettisoned. German engineers realized, too late, that this wasn't just fuel capacity. It was an operational strategy embedded into engineering. By the time they attempted to mass-produce similar systems, the Luftwaffe was already crippled by fuel shortages, bomber raids, and vanishing pilot numbers. The Mustang's drop tanks didn't simply extend range. They collapsed the Luftwaffe's last advantage: geography. For the first time in the war, Germany had nowhere left to retreat to, no safe interior. Berlin was no longer the heart of the Reich. It became the front line.